August 6, 1945. Deep beneath the streets of Tokyo, the underground war rooms of the Imperial General Headquarters were lit only by the pale glow of scattered lamps. The air was thick, heavy with cigarette smoke and silence. Outside, the city waited in darkness, unaware that in a few short hours, the war Japan had waged for nearly a decade would change forever. Inside, the men who had built this war, admirals, generals, ministers, and strategists, gathered around a long, polished table scarred from years of desperate planning. The morning dispatch arrived with the usual reports: bombings in industrial cities, shortages in steel and aviation fuel, shipping losses in the Pacific. But among those routine messages was one cable that froze the room. A transmission from Hiroshima had just been intercepted. Short, fractured, nearly incoherent. A single weapon had obliterated an entire city. At first, the staff officers thought it must be an exaggeration or a tactical strike. But the reports kept coming in. Communication lines cut, blinding light described, shadows burned into walls. Some of the younger aides whispered nervously, others clung to the belief that it must have been a conventional bombing. But the older men at the table, the veterans of campaigns across China and the Pacific, said nothing. They understood the language of power, and this weapon, whatever it was unlike anything they had ever faced. The shock that began in that bunker would ripple outward, consuming the entire command structure over the next 9 days. As they pored over intercepted intelligence and stared at maps filled with U.S. fleets and airfields, they would slowly, painfully, confront a truth too great to deny. The empire they had built on spirit and willpower was standing before an enemy that had been holding back. In the summer of 1945, the leadership of Imperial General Headquarters still clung to the fragments of a war plan that no longer existed. Even as American bombers scorched their cities and naval blockades starved their empire, the idea of a decisive battle remained deeply embedded in their military psyche. In meeting after meeting, senior commanders invoked ancient words like honor, sacrifice, and divine wind. These were not just slogans. They were the foundation upon which Japan had built its confidence for years. The High Command had spent months telling themselves that the United States, for all its machines and resources, lacked the spiritual strength to endure a long and costly war. In their eyes, Americans were soft, raised in comfort, unprepared for a brutal, drawn-out conflict. Japanese officers, shaped by the unforgiving code of Bushido, believed that their iron discipline and willingness to die for the emperor would compensate for every technological gap. Even as cities like Tokyo and Osaka burned under relentless bombing raids, they convinced themselves that spirit could outlast steel. At briefings, maps were covered with bright red lines marking where they hoped to launch counterattacks. Reports emphasized the bravery of kamikaze pilots, the stubborn resistance in the Philippines, and the dream that when the U.S. finally landed on the home islands, Japan would bleed it so badly that it would sue for peace on favorable terms. These were not realistic assessments, they were desperate hopes. But beneath the surface of this rhetoric, cracks were already forming. Intelligence officers knew what many generals refused to admit: the enemy's strength was far beyond anything Japan had imagined when it declared war in 1941. American convoys stretched across the Pacific, their supply chains smooth and unstoppable. Carrier task forces struck at will, appearing off Japan's shores like storms that could not be predicted or controlled. And yet, in the war rooms, the language did not change. They still spoke of honor, not tonnage, of spirit, not production capacity, of glorious final battles, not the grim reality of burned cities and silent factories. The illusion of strength was their last weapon, and it was fading fast, what no one around that polished table could admit aloud. Not yet was that the war they believed they were still fighting had already ended. They were preparing for battles that would never come, against a power that had already decided the outcome. By early August 1945, the empire that had once stretched from Burma to the islands of the Central Pacific was surrounded on all sides. What had begun as an ambitious campaign to build a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere had collapsed into a shrinking defensive ring. American forces, coordinated with overwhelming precision, had advanced island by island, fortress by fortress, closing the distance to Japan with a speed no one in Tokyo had anticipated. From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, each island taken became a new launching pad, not just for planes and ships, but for the inevitable invasion of the home islands. By the summer of 1945, American air bases surrounded Japan like an iron chain. From the Marianas came waves of bombers. From the Philippines came shipping convoys and submarines. From Okinawa came the threat of hundreds of thousands of troops waiting for the order to strike. Even the northern approaches were no longer safe. The Pacific, once Japan's strategic shield, had become the enemy's road. Naval intelligence reports reaching the Imperial General Headquarters painted a picture more devastating than any battlefield loss. The Japanese merchant fleet had been reduced to a fraction of its strength. Tankers were sunk faster than they could be built. Fuel had to be rationed so severely that many training flights for pilots were cancelled altogether. Warships remained anchored in port, unable to move without exposing themselves to overwhelming enemy air power. The once proud Imperial Navy, which had shocked the world in 1941, now spent its final days hiding in harbors, powerless. But what frightened the High Command more than American ships was the silence of the seas. Convoys bringing oil from the south had been destroyed. Submarines lurked in the deep, severing the empire's arteries. Industrial cities no longer received the raw materials they needed to keep weapons factories running. Steel was short, aviation fuel scarcer still. Every week, the war machine slowed down a little more. American intelligence had done more than encircle Japan militarily. It had strangled it strategically. U.S. fleets didn't need to storm every port to win. They simply waited, cutting off lifelines and tightening the noose. In their war rooms, Japanese planners still talked of defending the homeland with a decisive blow. But many of them already understood the truth. Their empire was not a fortress. It was a drowning island, isolated in the Pacific, with the tide rising fast. When the sun rose over Tokyo in the summer of 1945, it no longer marked the beginning of a normal day. For the people of Japan, daylight meant the sound of engines. The heavy, relentless drone of American bombers had become the daily rhythm of war. By this point, the U.S. didn't need to hide its approach. Entire formations of B-29 Superfortress bombers flew in perfect formation, crossing the Pacific skies as if no force could challenge them. Because none could. At first, years earlier, the sight of a single bomber was enough to stir air raid sirens and mobilize defenses. Now, waves of hundreds moved almost unopposed. They came not in the darkness of night, but under clear skies, bold and unchallenged. Japan's air defense network, once a proud system of alert posts and fighter squadrons, was now a hollow shell. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Radar coverage was incomplete. Fighter units were sent up with barely trained pilots, often with less than an hour of flight experience, facing the best-trained bomber crews in the world. The bombing of cities like Kobe, Osaka, and Tokyo itself was not just a military campaign. It was a systematic erasure of Japan's industrial core. Precision bombing was no longer necessary. The U.S. strategy had shifted to firebombing, creating storms of flame that devoured everything. In Tokyo alone, a single night raid in March had killed over 100,000 people, more than many battlefield campaigns. Factories melted, homes collapsed, and entire neighborhoods turned to ash. In the underground war rooms, Japanese generals received daily situation reports. They were not reports of resistance. They were lists of what had been lost. Rail hubs destroyed. Steel plants gone. Bridges collapsed. Entire production lines wiped out overnight. The military could no longer keep up with the destruction, but perhaps the most devastating blow was psychological. The Japanese military had believed that their homeland was protected, that the Pacific was their shield, that invading their skies would come at a terrible cost. Instead, American bombers flew overhead like executioners, their power absolute, their losses minimal. Civilians huddled in shelters, listening to the sky roar above them. Soldiers on leave returned home to find only ashes. And the High Command, men who once promised their emperor that Japan's skies would never be breached, sat beneath those skies in silence, realizing their enemy didn't just possess air superiority. They possessed the sky itself. The illusion of defense was gone. Japan was no longer defending a homeland. It was enduring a siege from above, and this was only the beginning of what was to come. The morning of atomic bombing of Hiroshima began like countless others in wartime Japan. The sirens had not sounded. The sky was clear, almost peaceful. Civilians in Hiroshima went about their day, unaware that in the high, silent air above them, the future of warfare had already arrived. At 8:15 a.m., a single B-29 Superfortress bomber, far too small a formation to alarm the city's air defenses, released a weapon unlike any that had ever been used before. A blinding flash tore across the sky, followed by a wave of heat and force so violent that it erased entire blocks in an instant. In a single breath, a city that had taken centuries to build was consumed. Witnesses near the epicenter didn't even have time to scream. Their shadows were burned into walls as their bodies vanished. When the first fragmentary reports reached Tokyo, the High Command didn't believe them. Some officers assumed it was just another firebombing raid. Others thought the destruction was exaggerated. But the messages didn't stop. Reconnaissance reports confirmed the unimaginable. Hiroshima was gone. Not damaged, not heavily bombed, gone. Japanese scientists in the War Ministry recognized immediately what the Americans had done. For months, they had discussed the possibility of a superweapon that could release massive energy, but most believed such a device was still theoretical. Now that theory had become reality. A single bomb had done what entire fleets of aircraft could not. In the underground war room, silence fell as maps were laid on the table. The estimated destructive radius was larger than anything in modern history. It wasn't just a bomb, it was a message. The United States had just demonstrated a level of power beyond the comprehension of even Japan's most seasoned strategists. Military planners began running calculations. If the U.S. had one bomb, how many more could they produce? How many cities would vanish before the planned invasion even began? They had no answers, and that terrified them more than any battle. One intelligence officer quietly whispered that the Americans may have been holding back their full power all along. The room fell silent. Those words struck at the core of everything the High Command believed. If this was only the beginning, then the end would not come through battle, but through annihilation. Outside, ordinary citizens didn't know the full scale of what had happened. But the High Command did. For the first time in the entire war, they faced a weapon against which there was no defense. Spirit, bravery, and sacrifice could not stop the light that fell over Hiroshima. In the days following atomic bombing of Hiroshima, the shock within Imperial General Headquarters deepened into something colder. Calculation. Gone were the emotional speeches about honor and unbreakable spirit. Now, senior officers gathered in dimly lit war rooms, surrounded by maps, tables covered with casualty projections, and intelligence reports written in clipped, clinical language. Japan had spent years convincing itself that America's war machine was stretched thin, that a nation so far across the Pacific could not sustain a long, grinding campaign. But, as intercepted communications and intelligence assessments were laid out in front of them, a terrible realization spread like poison through the room. They had been catastrophically wrong. The Americans had not been fighting at full capacity. They had been holding back. An intelligence officer presented the updated figures. American factories were producing thousands of M4 Sherman tanks and hundreds of B-29 Superfortress bombers every month. Their aircraft carriers roamed the Pacific like floating fortresses. Supply chains stretched from California to the front lines without collapsing. By mid-1945, the United States had built a wartime production capacity larger than the combined output of the Axis powers. One staff member pointed to a chart showing how many planes the U.S. had deployed in the Pacific compared to what remained in reserve. The room went silent. What was already devastating Japan was only a fraction of what America could unleash. The atomic bomb wasn't the peak of American power. It was just the exclamation point. Another briefing revealed details that cut even deeper. American war planners had been preparing an invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall. It wasn't just one landing. It was a massive multi-wave assault involving more than 5 million men, 40 aircraft carriers, thousands of ships, and overwhelming air cover. If Japan chose to keep fighting, the numbers guaranteed only one outcome: total destruction. A senior general traced a finger along a map of the home islands where American forces would likely land. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he said, "We cannot stop this." That sentence, simple, quiet, was more devastating than the bomb itself. The myths of Japanese invincibility, the belief that spiritual strength could overcome material power, crumbled under the weight of cold arithmetic. Spirit could not stop aircraft carriers. Honor could not match production lines that never slept. For years, the High Command had believed in the strategy of bleeding the enemy slowly, making the cost of invasion unbearable. But as they examined America's staggering capacity to rebuild, rearm, and strike again, they realized there was no bleeding a nation that never seemed to run out of blood. The generals did not cry out or rage. They sat in heavy silence, each man understanding that what they were facing was not just defeat, but the death of the military system they had built their lives upon, and then came the second blow, one they did not expect. News from the north that would shatter the last defensive illusion they held August 8, 1945. In the pre-dawn darkness of Tokyo, a messenger ran through the halls of Imperial General Headquarters with a sealed cable clutched in his hands. His face was pale, his breath unsteady. Inside the war room, senior generals were still debating their response to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. None of them expected what came next. The cable bore a message from the Northern Front. Soviet armed forces had declared war on Empire of Japan. Massive Soviet armies were pouring across the borders of Manchuria. Their tanks, the fast, battle-hardened T-34, were cutting through Japanese defensive lines like a blade through paper. For years, Tokyo's generals had clung to one fragile hope, that they could negotiate a surrender through Moscow. The Soviet Union had been officially neutral in the Pacific War, and the High Command believed they could use that neutrality to buy time or secure better surrender terms. But that illusion evaporated the moment Stalin's forces struck. A map of Manchuria was unrolled across the table. Red arrows representing Soviet movements swept through Japanese positions at terrifying speed. Reports spoke of entire divisions overwhelmed in hours, not days. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Imperial Army, was being annihilated before it could even properly mobilize. The Soviet advance was unlike anything the Japanese had faced in the Pacific. These were veterans who had crushed the Wehrmacht in Europe, who had stormed Berlin itself. Their logistical machine was ruthless and efficient, and unlike the Americans, the Soviets gave no quarter. No warnings, no promises of humane treatment. For the Japanese High Command, this changed everything. America's overwhelming power was already terrifying, but it came with a degree of predictability. The Soviets, on the other hand, represented something primal and uncontrollable. If Japan resisted, there was now a real possibility that the Soviet Union would carve the home islands in two, just as they had divided Germany. The emperor's advisors quickly understood the nightmare scenario. If the Soviets reached the Japanese mainland first, Japan would not just lose the war, it would lose its sovereignty entirely. Stalin would install his own government. The imperial system could vanish overnight. Within hours, the mood in the war room shifted from grim calculation to urgency. Every general understood the geopolitical map of the world was changing, and Japan was now caught between two giants. The United States could destroy them, but the Soviets could erase them. In a quiet corner, one intelligence officer whispered to another, "Better surrender to America than be occupied by Russia." That sentiment, though spoken softly, spread like wildfire through the ranks of the leadership. They had once believed they could force favorable terms through diplomacy. Now, they were out of time. America had the bomb, the Soviets had the Red Army, and Japan had no more cards to play. As dawn broke over Tokyo, the golden morning light did not feel warm. It felt like a spotlight on a cornered empire. Next came the emperor's moment, a decision that would silence centuries of warrior. Pride. August 9th, 1945, Tokyo, inside the thick concrete walls of the imperial palace. A silence unlike any the nation had ever known hung in the air. It was not the silence of peace, nor the silence of defeat on the battlefield. It was the silence that comes before a nation is forced to choose between survival and destruction. For years, Hirohito had stood above politics and war, more a symbol than an active ruler. His voice was never heard in the war councils. Generals spoke of glory, admirals promised victory, and politicians swore loyalty to an empire they believed eternal. But on this day, the emperor's voice would be the only one that mattered. The members of Supreme War Council, Japan, gathered in the underground chamber, their faces drawn and pale. Some still believed they could fight on. They spoke of defending the homeland, of dying with honor, of taking millions of American lives in the process. But others, the few who understood the numbers, the overwhelming firepower of the United States Army, and the unstoppable advance of the Soviet armed forces, knew it was over. When the emperor entered, everyone fell silent. No one dared look directly at him. For years, they had built this war around his name. Now they waited for the same man to end it. The ministers presented their final assessments. They spoke of the bomb, the firebombing of Tokyo, the shattered fleets, the starving cities, and the looming Soviet invasion. One general proposed a final battle, a suicidal defense that would plunge the country into flames. Another countered that surrender to the Americans might at least save the imperial house. Then, breaking a tradition older than the war itself, the emperor spoke. His voice was calm, soft, almost gentle, but every word carried the weight of an empire. He said that continuing the war would mean nothing but the total annihilation of the Japanese people, that the war was not being fought for glory anymore, but for survival, and even that was slipping away. He acknowledged the unbearable suffering of his people, cities reduced to ashes, families torn apart, soldiers dying on islands no one had ever heard of. He spoke of the bomb not as a weapon, but as a sign that humanity itself had entered a new age of destruction, one that Japan could not hope to withstand. The generals listened, some with eyes lowered in shame, others with hands clenched in silent rage. For many of them, surrender was unthinkable. But in that moment, they realized something far more terrifying. The emperor had chosen survival over their pride. The debate that followed was bitter. Some called for honorable death, others for surrender. But in the end, the emperor's will prevailed, not because they wanted it, but because they had no power left to resist it. This was the moment Japan's war machine truly cracked. Not under American bombs, not under Soviet tanks, but under the quiet, unshakable decision of a man who had watched his nation burn. Outside the palace walls, Tokyo still smoldered. Trains were not running. Families were digging through ruins for food. American planes roared overhead with impunity. And in the underground war room, the fate of the empire was sealed not with gunfire, but with a voice. The next step would not be glorious. It would be the surrender of a warrior nation built on pride and myth. But before it could happen, the High Command had to face its own fractures. Men who would rather die than bowed on August 14, 1945. Midnight. The Suzy air inside the Imperial Palace complex was thick and heavy. Not just with summer humidity, but with the weight of a nation balanced on the edge of chaos. The decision to surrender had been made, the Emperor's voice recorded for broadcast, and preparations were underway to inform the world. But not everyone in Japan's military intended to let that surrender happen. A faction of young, fanatically loyal officers in the Imperial Japanese Army believed surrender was a betrayal of everything they had sworn to defend. These men had grown up on the creed of Bushido, the warrior's code that glorified death over submission. To them, surrender to the United States Armed Forces was worse than destruction. They called their plan Kyujo, a coup d'etat to stop the Emperor's surrender message from ever reaching the people. Their goal was chillingly simple: seize the palace, destroy the surrender recording, and control the lines of communication. Without the Emperor's voice announcing the end of the war, they believed they could rally the military to continue fighting, to turn the home islands into a final battlefield drenched in blood. As darkness covered Tokyo, armed soldiers began moving silently through the imperial grounds. Loyalist guards were outnumbered and confused. The conspirators managed to occupy the communications center and tried to locate the hidden recording that contained the Emperor's surrender speech. But even as they moved through the palace, something unexpected began to happen. Many senior officers they hoped to rally simply refused. The nation was exhausted. Entire divisions had been wiped out. Civilians were starving. For every officer ready to die for glory, there were others who quietly understood the truth. Japan could not win. The plotters searched frantically for the phonograph recording, which had been hidden in a nondescript office. They scoured the palace, opening drawers and breaking locks, but they could not find it. All the while, loyal guards and officers who supported surrender were moving just as carefully, trying to avoid a direct firefight inside the palace. In the early hours of the morning, the conspirators confronted General Shizuichi Tanaka, commander of the Eastern District Army, a man whose loyalty could make or break the coup. He was stern and calm. He did not shout. He simply told them that continuing this madness would bring nothing but shame to the emperor they claimed to protect. In that moment, their will began to fracture. Some conspirators backed down. Others realized that without widespread military support, their coup was doomed. The chaos began to dissolve as quickly as it had ignited. The emperor's recording remained safe. By sunrise, the coup had failed. But it had come dangerously close to succeeding. If the conspirators had found the recording or swayed key commanders, Japan could have been plunged into a civil war on the very night it decided to surrender. The emperor's voice, soft, distant, recorded on fragile wax, now carried the fate of millions. If it was heard, the war would end. If it was silenced, the bloodshed would continue. That night, as the city of Tokyo lay in ruins around them, Japan narrowly escaped a final, suicidal spiral into darkness. The following morning, for the first time in history, the people of Japan would hear their emperor speak, not of war, but of surrender. August 15, 1945. 12:44, noon. Across the Empire of Japan, citizens gathered around radios in silence. Families huddled in half-burned homes, Soldiers in remote garrisons stopped what they were doing. Even air raid sirens were quiet. For the first time in history, the people of Japan would hear the voice of their emperor, not as a distant, godlike figure, but as a man announcing the end of a war that had consumed their world. The recording had been carefully hidden from the coup plotters just hours earlier. Now, it was placed onto the phonograph inside the palace. The fragile wax disc held more power than any weapon left in Japan's arsenal. One needle drop would decide the fate of millions. As the recording began, the room filled with the unmistakable, formal cadence of Hirohito's voice. Many listeners had never heard him speak before. His words were measured, ceremonial, but they carried a weight unlike anything the nation had experienced. He spoke of enduring the unendurable, of accepting surrender to save the people from total annihilation. He never said the word surrender directly, but everyone understood. For soldiers who had been trained to die for the emperor, the moment was shattering. On the front lines in Okinawa, in bunkers, in coastal defenses, they stood frozen as the realization sank in. The emperor had chosen to live, not die, and so must they. In cities reduced to ash, mothers clutched their children and wept quietly. Farmers working in the fields stopped their labor and bowed their heads. Prisoners in camps, both Japanese and foreign, looked to the sky as the sounds of planes overhead slowly faded. For many, the emperor's words felt like both a wound and a mercy. Pride was broken, but life was spared. It was the death of the old Japan, the empire of conquest and warrior myth, and the beginning of something unknown. In military barracks, some officers quietly removed their sidearms and placed them on the table. Others stared at the ground, unable to reconcile their training with the reality they faced. A few took their own lives rather than accept surrender, but the vast majority, though stunned and defeated, obeyed the emperor's will. The sound of his voice traveled across islands and oceans, from Tokyo to the most distant outposts still holding out against the Allies. Battles that had dragged on for years ended in moments as units laid down their arms. For the first time since 1937, the guns fell silent. The war that began with fire now ended with a voice. Not the roar of bombers, not the thunder of artillery, but the calm, deliberate words of a man who chose survival over destruction. In that moment, the myth of invincibility died, but from its ashes, a chance for a future, fragile and uncertain, was born. Next came the reckoning. Defeat was now a fact, but how the world, and Japan itself, would respond to that defeat would define the decades to come. August 15, 1945. 12 Sart noon. Across the Empire of Japan, citizens gathered around radios in silence. Families huddled in half-burned homes. Soldiers in remote garrisons stopped what they were doing. Even air raid sirens were quiet. For the first time in history, the people of Japan would hear the voice of their emperor, not as a distant, godlike figure, but as a man announcing the end of a war that had consumed their world. The recording had been carefully hidden from the coup plotters just hours earlier. Now, it was placed onto the phonograph inside the palace. The fragile wax disc held more power than any weapon left in Japan's arsenal. One needle drop would decide the fate of millions. As the recording began, the room filled with the unmistakable, formal cadence of Hirohito's voice. Many listeners had never heard him speak before. His words were measured, ceremonial, but they carried a weight unlike anything the nation had experienced. He spoke of enduring the unendurable, of accepting surrender to save the people from total annihilation. He never said the word surrender directly, but everyone understood. For soldiers who had been trained to die for the emperor, the moment was shattering. On the front lines in Okinawa, in bunkers, in coastal defenses, they stood frozen as the realization sank in. The emperor had chosen to live, not die. And so must they. In cities reduced to ash, mothers clutched their children and wept quietly. Farmers working in the fields stopped their labor and bowed their heads. Prisoners in camps, both Japanese and foreign, looked to the sky as the sounds of planes overhead slowly faded. For many, the emperor's words felt like both a wound and a mercy. Pride was broken, but life was spared. It was the death of the old Japan, the empire of conquest and warrior myth, and the beginning of something unknown. In military barracks, some officers quietly removed their sidearms and placed them on the table. Others stared at the ground, unable to reconcile their training with the reality they faced. A few took their own lives rather than accept surrender, but the vast majority, though stunned and defeated, obeyed the emperor's will. The sound of his voice traveled across islands and oceans, from Tokyo to the most distant outposts still holding out against the Allies. Battles that had dragged on for years ended in moments as units laid down their arms. For the first time since 1937, the guns fell silent. The war that began with fire now ended with a voice. Not the roar of bombers, not the thunder of artillery, but the calm, deliberate words of a man who chose survival over destruction. In that moment, the myth of invincibility died, but from its ashes, a chance for a future, fragile and uncertain, was born. Next came the reckoning. Defeat was now a fact, but how the world, and Japan itself, would respond to that defeat would define the decades to come. In the days following the signing of the Japanese instrument of surrender, the rising sun that once symbolized imperial ambition shone upon a nation on its knees. Cities lay in ruins, factories were silent shells, and millions of people faced a future they could not yet comprehend. Japan, once the proud center of an empire stretching across Asia, was now an occupied land under the control of the Allied occupation of Japan, led by Douglas MacArthur. Tokyo, once the beating heart of the imperial war machine, had become a city of ghosts. Bombing raids had reduced neighborhoods to charred rubble. Tram lines were twisted metal, streets filled with blackened timbers. Families wandered through the ruins searching for anything salvageable. Mothers clutched children in threadbare clothing. Former soldiers, stripped of rank and power, stared blankly at the horizon, unsure where to go. The weight of defeat was not just physical, it was psychological. For years, the Japanese people had been told their nation was divine, their emperor godlike, their soldiers invincible. Now, the invincible army had been broken. The god emperor had ordered surrender. The myths that held the nation together had been stripped away in a single shattering summer. On September 8, 1945, Douglas MacArthur arrived in Tokyo to oversee the occupation. His headquarters in the Dai-ichi Life Insurance Company building overlooked the Imperial Palace, a symbol of American authority watching over the old heart of imperial power. The occupation was not just military. It was a deliberate effort to reshape the nation itself. The Japanese people watched as foreign soldiers walked their streets, patrolled their stations, distributed food, and enforced order. For some, this was humiliation. For others, it was survival. American trucks carried supplies into cities where hunger had become a daily enemy. Hospitals began receiving medicine. For the first time in years, food distribution slowly resumed. But even with aid, shame and confusion weighed heavily on the population. Young officers who had been trained to fight to the death returned home in silence. War widows carried photographs of men who would never return. Children played in the ruins of bombed-out schools, too young to fully understand why the world had burned. In the countryside, the story was no different. Fields that once supplied armies now struggled to feed the people. Millions of returning soldiers flooded villages with no work waiting for them. Some tried to rebuild quietly. Others felt lost. Their identity, forged in war, had evaporated overnight. For the high command that had led the war, there was no hiding. Trials loomed on the horizon. The world demanded accountability for the devastation they had unleashed. And for the emperor himself, the question remained, would he stand as a symbol of survival or be swept away by the tide of history? Defeat was not a single moment. It was a weight that pressed on every home, every street, every thought. And it was in this weight that the real transformation of Japan would begin. A transformation forced by foreign hands, but ultimately shaped by the will of its people. The war had ended, but the reckoning was only beginning. November 1945. The halls of Ichigaya Court in Tokyo were lined with guards, journalists, and Allied officers. What had once been a military academy was now the stage for one of the most significant war crimes trials in history. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East. For years, Japan's leaders had waged war across Asia and the Pacific, convinced of their divine mission. Now, seated behind wooden benches, those same men faced judgment. The world had seen the ruins of Nanjing, Manila, and countless villages. It had seen the brutal treatment of prisoners of war, the mass starvation, the forced labor, the medical experiments, the human cost of empire. Now, the architects of that empire would have to answer for it. 28 individuals stood accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. Among them were generals, admirals, ministers, and officials who had once spoken of conquest with absolute certainty. Men like Hideki Tojo, the wartime prime minister, who had led Japan into a conflict that consumed millions of lives. The tribunal was modeled after the Nuremberg trials in Europe. Judges from 11 Allied nations, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, the United Kingdom, France, Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, New Zealand, India, and the Philippines presided over the proceedings. For the first time in Japanese history, the highest leaders of the empire were no longer beyond the reach of law. Day after day, evidence was presented. Intercepted communications, military orders, witness testimony from soldiers, prisoners, and civilians. The cold, methodical machinery of war was laid bare. The defense tried to argue necessity, that Japan had been cornered, that it had fought for survival. But the facts spoke louder. Forced marches, massacres, torture, and a war of aggression. Hideki Tojo sat silent for much of the trial. Gone was the fiery rhetoric, the iron confidence. In its place was the quiet resignation of a man watching his empire's narrative crumble. Other defendants showed defiance, others shame, others indifference. But none could escape the truth being recorded in meticulous detail. Outside the courtroom, the Japanese public followed the proceedings with a mix of confusion, bitterness, and quiet reflection. For years, their government had painted the war as noble. Now, they were forced to confront a different story, one told through the suffering of millions across Asia. In December 1948, verdicts were delivered. 7 were sentenced to death, including Tojo. Others received life sentences. Some were acquitted. But the significance of the tribunal extended beyond punishment. It set a precedent. Leaders could be held accountable for their wars. And yet, one figure was absent from the defendant's chair. Hirohito. The emperor had been spared prosecution. Not because he was uninvolved, but because the Allies, particularly the United States, believed his presence was crucial for a stable post-war occupation. It was a political decision, one that would shape how Japan remembered the war for decades to come. When the sentences were carried out at Sugamo prison, it was done quietly. No crowds, no spectacle, just the final act of a war that had burned across half the globe. For the Japanese people, these trials were not just about justice. They were about facing the past, a past built on illusions of divine mission, military supremacy, and imperial destiny. The myth had shattered. What remained was a nation forced to rebuild not only its cities, but its identity. The war was over. The guilty had been judged. But the story of how a warrior empire became a defeated nation, and then something entirely new, was still unfolding. 1946. A cold wind swept through the ruins of Tokyo, where proud avenues and imperial boulevards once stretched, now stood skeletal buildings, twisted steel and fields of rubble. But amid the devastation, something new was taking root. The war had ended in fire, but what came after would be forged in silence, labor, and quiet determination. The Allied occupation of Japan, led by Douglas MacArthur, was unlike any occupation the modern world had seen. It wasn't designed merely to punish. It was designed to rebuild and reshape. Japan's old imperial system, once defined by military ambition, was being systematically dismantled. In its place, a new structure was rising, one that would change the course of the nation forever. The first major transformation came in 1946 with the drafting of a new constitution. The Constitution of Japan, guided by American advisors but accepted by Japanese officials, was revolutionary. It stripped the emperor of political power, guaranteeing instead a symbolic role. Hirohito remained on the chrysanthemum throne, but not as a god, as a human. His voice, once divine, now echoed as a reminder of a past that could not return. Article 9 of the new Constitution stunned the world. It renounced war as a means of settling international disputes, and forever forbade Japan from maintaining a military for aggression. For a nation that had once worshipped its army and navy, this was more than a legal clause. It was a cultural earthquake. But change wasn't just written on paper. It was built with hands. Factories that once produced tanks and aircraft were repurposed to build tools, textiles, electronics, and eventually the technology that would power Japan's future. Roads were rebuilt, power lines restored, water systems repaired. Schools reopened. Food aid programs helped stave off famine. In the countryside, families who had lost everything began to cultivate fields again. In cities, people cleared debris and set up makeshift shops. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic turning point. Japan was being rebuilt through millions of quiet, stubborn acts of survival. American soldiers, once enemies, now walked the streets not as conquerors, but as occupiers tasked with ensuring stability. For many Japanese, the sight of American troops handing out food, chocolate, and cigarettes was bewildering. Only months earlier, these same soldiers were portrayed as monsters. Now, they were standing in line with children, sharing rations. Culturally, too, the nation shifted. Jazz music floated through the ruins of Tokyo. Western movies flickered in makeshift theaters. A generation raised on imperial propaganda was now growing up with ideas of democracy, free speech, and modernity. It was not an easy transition. Pride had been broken, but in the cracks of defeat, resilience began to grow. The transformation wasn't immediate or painless. There was anger, loss, humiliation, but also a slow awakening to the possibility of a different future. What had begun as occupation was slowly becoming rebirth. By the end of the decade, the world would no longer see Japan as the empire that bombed Pearl Harbor or marched across Asia. It would see a nation clawing its way from ruin, determined to redefine itself not through war, but through creation. But the shadow of the war, the memory of that final summer of fire, bombs, and surrender, would never fully disappear. It would shape everything that came after. In the years that followed the Japanese instrument of surrender, the world changed swiftly. But in Japan, the echoes of 1945 remained embedded in the nation's soul. The blast waves of atomic bombing of Hiroshima and atomic bombing of Nagasaki did not simply level cities. They shattered illusions. The myth of divine invincibility was gone. Yet, in its place, something quieter, stronger, and more enduring began to grow. Every corner of Japan carried the memory. In the flattened ruins of Hiroshima, survivors rebuilt homes beside the skeletal remains of the Genbaku Dome. In Tokyo, the Imperial Palace still stood, but around it rose new offices, schools, and streets bustling with merchants and students. The sound of marching boots was slowly replaced by the noise of industry, trains, and construction. But history has a way of whispering, even when the world moves forward. In schools, teachers told students not only about victory or defeat, but about the cost of war. Textbooks began to carry facts once hidden. Children who had grown up under a war banner were now hearing a different story. One about choices, consequences, and a world divided not by divine missions, but by power. The echoes of American might lingered as well. The site of USS Missouri, BB-63 in Tokyo Bay, remained a national memory, a reminder of how swiftly power could turn the tide of history. In military archives and war colleges around the world, Japan's defeat became a lesson that industrial capacity and technological innovation could outweigh even the fiercest warrior spirit. American power had not only broken the empire's armies, it had redrawn the strategic map of the Pacific. Japan, once the aggressor, became the front line of a new era, the Cold War. Bases built by the United States Armed Forces during the occupation would remain, turning the islands into a fortress of another kind. Not for imperial expansion, but as part of a global balance of power. Within Japan, that presence left a complicated legacy. Some saw it as protection, others as humiliation. But it was undeniable. The echo of American strength shaped the nation's future as much as the fire had shaped its past. Economically, Japan began to rise again. Factories once dedicated to war now produced the goods of peacetime. Radios, cameras, cars, and eventually electronics that would spread across the globe. The nation that once sought to dominate Asia through force was now learning to influence it through innovation and commerce. But beneath this transformation, the ghosts of 1945 lingered. Hiroshima and Nagasaki stood as silent testimonies to the cost of war. Monuments were built, not for victory, but for remembrance. Survivors, the hibakusha, told their stories to schoolchildren who had never heard air raid sirens or seen foreign troops. The echo of power was not just about America's might. It was also about Japan's decision, made in those final desperate weeks, to live rather than die, to surrender not to humiliation, but to survival. That choice, made in the emperor's underground chamber, echoed louder than any explosion. Decades later, when Japan would emerge as one of the world's leading economies, that echo would still be there, faint but unbroken. A reminder of the summer when a warrior empire faced the full weight of American power and chose to lay down its sword. The war had ended long ago, but the lessons it carved into history remained. Power could conquer, power could destroy, but survival, and what a nation builds after its greatest fall, could echo across generations. When the sun rose over Tokyo on September 3, 1945, the first dawn after the Japanese instrument of surrender, it touched a land no longer ruled by an empire at war. For the first time in more than a decade, no orders were shouted from military barracks. No bombers flew overhead. The once feared imperial war machine had fallen silent. In its place came the uncertain hush of peace. The decision made in the emperor's underground war chamber had ended a war that burned across continents. But it also began something else, the slow, unsteady birth of a new Japan. The surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri, BB-63, had marked not just the empire's defeat, but the beginning of its transformation. The rising sun flag that had once symbolized conquest now hung limp in a humid September breeze, its meaning forever changed. The first challenge was survival. Cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki were ash and rubble. Millions were displaced, homes destroyed, industries shattered. Trains no longer arrived on time. Food was scarce, fuel scarcer still. Entire towns moved like shadows, searching for whatever remained of their lives before the firestorms. But among the ruins, something began to stir. Civilians who had lived under the harsh discipline of a militarized empire now faced a world where they could, cautiously, make choices again. Markets reopened in shattered neighborhoods. Farmers returned to their fields, repairing plows with scavenged metal. Children, barefoot and hungry, still found ways to play in the rubble. Life, fragile and bruised, refused to vanish. The arrival of occupation forces under Douglas MacArthur brought both fear and a strange relief. Many Japanese citizens had expected cruelty, retribution, or the chaos of foreign rule. Instead, they encountered something entirely different. American soldiers handing out chocolate to children, food packages to families, and supplies to schools. The overwhelming power that had forced surrender was now shaping the terms of survival. Japan was no longer a conqueror. It was being rebuilt, piece by piece, under watchful eyes, with blueprints drawn far from its shores. Factories once used for planes and tanks were stripped down and converted to produce tools, bicycles, radios. Classrooms reopened, universities revived, and slowly the people began to find their footing in a country that was no longer imperial, but occupied. The most powerful transformation, however, was not in the buildings, but in the minds. The entire generation that had grown up believing in the divine mission of the emperor was now learning that the world did not revolve around Japan's sword. Newspapers that once printed only propaganda now carried unfamiliar words: democracy, rights, freedom of speech. The Americans brought not just military dominance, but an entirely different way of life. Their wealth, their technology, their culture, everything from their music to their chewing gum left a mark deeper than any bomb crater. For many Japanese, it was bewildering. For others, it was a window into a world they had never imagined. This rebirth was not simple or painless. The loss of national identity, the humiliation of surrender, the slow erosion of old beliefs. These were scars that would linger for decades. But beneath those scars, something new was taking root. The foundation of a modern nation. Japan had once fought to dominate the Pacific. Now it was learning to live in it, no longer a sword, but a student of the modern world. It was a transformation born not out of choice, but of necessity. Yet it would shape the nation more profoundly than any victory ever could. The fires of war had destroyed Japan's empire. But from those ashes, a different Japan, fragile, watchful, and reborn, began to rise. In the weeks that followed Japan's surrender, the country no longer moved to the commands of its own generals. Instead, a new authority took hold. One draped not in the rising sun, but in the star-spangled banner of the United States Army. At the heart of this new order stood Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. To many Japanese, he was a distant, almost mythical figure. The man who had defeated their empire and now held the pen that would shape their future. MacArthur's arrival in Tokyo was nothing short of symbolic. The tall American general, wearing his signature sunglasses and open-collar shirt, walked through the once unshakable bastion of imperial power as though the war had been decided long before the bombs fell. For years, Japanese propaganda had painted Americans as monsters, brutal, barbaric, heartless. But the figure who now stood at the center of their ruined capital carried himself not as a conqueror, but as an architect. Beneath the surface, however, the occupation was anything but gentle. Entire ministries were dissolved. Senior military officers were arrested and later tried in war tribunals. Statues of imperial heroes were removed from public spaces. Even the most sacred pillar of Japanese identity, the emperor himself, was forced to stand before the world and renounce his divine status. When Hirohito spoke to his people on the radio, his voice calm yet stripped of its godlike aura. It was as if a century of belief had cracked in a single moment. The Allied occupation forces quickly took control of everything that had once defined Japanese sovereignty. Ports, railways, communication lines, and factories all came under foreign supervision. At first, fear swept through the population like a cold wind. Civilians whispered that retribution was coming, that the conquerors would strip their homes, take their families, punish the nation for Pearl Harbor. But as days turned into weeks, the Japanese people began to see something they did not expect. The Americans were strict, but they were not vengeful. They punished war criminals, but they also distributed food. They censored nationalist propaganda, but they reopened schools. They dismantled the machinery of war, but they also rebuilt hospitals and power stations. This duality created an atmosphere of both tension and reluctant trust. The occupation was a shadow, sometimes heavy and suffocating, sometimes a strange source of stability. Every citizen lived with the awareness that their future no longer belonged fully to them. Decisions about their economy, politics, and even their culture were made elsewhere, in foreign offices and military headquarters. And yet, under this shadow, something remarkable began to happen. The same people who had once rallied under imperial banners began to adapt. Teachers who once taught obedience to the emperor now taught the language of democracy. Newspapers that once glorified conquest now published debates. Small businesses began to reopen under the protection of occupation law. The shock of defeat had broken the empire, but the structure of occupation was slowly, deliberately, reshaping what it meant to be Japanese in a world no longer defined by war. For many, this change was painful, a daily reminder of their nation's humiliation. For others, it was a chance to survive, to rebuild, to quietly imagine a different kind of future. Above all, the occupation made one truth undeniable: Japan would never again be the same. The soldiers in American uniforms were not just victors. They were the custodians of a new order. Their presence was a constant reminder of both the cost of defeat and the possibility of transformation. The shadow of occupation was long and complex, but in its darkness, the seeds of modern Japan were being planted. One policy, one school, one rebuilt bridge at a time. In the months that followed Japan's unconditional surrender, a quiet but profound war unfolded, not fought with rifles or artillery, but with words, laws, and ideas. It was the war to redefine what Japan would become. For decades, the empire had shaped its people through rigid hierarchy, emperor worship, and the belief in sacrifice above all else. Now, those pillars were deliberately, systematically dismantled by the new Allied administration. At the center of this transformation was a bold vision: to ensure that Japan would never again rise as a military threat, but also to give its people the tools to build a democratic society. Under the command of Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers launched one of the most ambitious social engineering projects in modern history. Ministries that once served the emperor's war machine were replaced with civilian institutions. Thought police disappeared overnight, and in their place came legal guarantees for free expression and association. But the most defining blow came in the form of a single document: a new constitution. Drafted in a matter of weeks by a team of Allied officials and legal scholars, it stripped away the last vestiges of Japan's militarist past. Article 9, perhaps the most radical clause of all, declared that Japan would forever renounce war as a means of settling international disputes. The words were clear, powerful, and irreversible. A nation that once glorified conquest now signed a legal promise to never wage war again. For the Japanese leadership, this moment was both humiliating and bewildering. Men who had spent their entire lives building an empire of steel and fire now stood in silent rooms, staring at legal texts they had no power to reject. The generals were gone. The old politicians were either purged or powerless. In their place emerged a new generation of technocrats and reformers, men who had once lived in the shadows of the military elite. Schools became the front line of this ideological transformation. History books were rewritten to remove imperial glorification. Children who had once memorized military slogans now read about democracy, civic responsibility, and human rights. Teachers who had pledged loyalty to the emperor now stood before classrooms and taught the language of freedom. This was not just a change of curriculum. It was a deliberate rewriting of national identity. Cultural change seeped slowly into daily life. Women, who for centuries had been confined to narrow roles, were granted the right to vote. For the first time in Japanese history, women's voices entered the halls of power. Newspapers were allowed to criticize government policies. Street posters no longer carried military slogans, but instead urged participation in elections, education, and rebuilding. The people themselves were divided. Some embraced the new order, seeing in it a chance to escape the chains of an old, suffocating system. Others resented it deeply, viewing these reforms as a foreign imposition meant to erase their heritage. And yet, as factories began to produce consumer goods instead of weapons, as food lines grew shorter and schools reopened, a strange acceptance took root. The soul of Japan was not being erased. It was being rewritten under the watchful eyes of its former enemy. In the streets of Tokyo, American soldiers walked side by side with Japanese civilians. The same uniforms that had once represented a distant, terrifying power now became symbols of order, of an unfamiliar but undeniable stability. This transformation did not erase the trauma of defeat. The memory of burned cities, lost sons, and fallen empires remained etched into the collective memory of the nation. But for the first time in living memory, Japan's destiny was being charted not by admirals and generals, but by civilians, teachers, engineers, and dreamers. The war had ended with the roar of atomic fire. But what followed was quieter, deeper, and perhaps even more powerful. It was the slow, deliberate rebirth of a nation.